A strange summer. There are summers we remember for their warmth, for long afternoons that stretch lazily into evening, for the way the sun lingers and the air hums softly with insects and distant voices. But in the year 1816, summer did not behave as it was supposed to. In many places across the northern hemisphere, people woke expecting warmth and instead found frost. Fields that should have been green were dusted with ice. Gardens failed to wake from spring. In some regions, snow fell in June, light, quiet snow, settling briefly before melting away, as if unsure whether it belonged. The sun still rose each morning, but it felt weaker. Its light was pale, filtered, and strangely dim. Days passed beneath gray skies that never quite cleared. At first, no one thought it was anything more than unusual weather. After all, seasons had always varied. A cold week could be followed by warmth. A late frost might be forgiven. Farmers waited. Gardeners replanted. People pulled their coats tighter and assumed summer would arrive tomorrow. But tomorrow came, and the cold remained. In towns and villages, conversations began to change, not in panic, not yet, but in tone. "This is odd," people said. "This isn't right." Fires burned longer into the evenings. Wool stayed on shoulders well past the month it should have been stored away. Rain fell often, slow and persistent, soaking soil that never had the chance to warm. No one knew the cause. There were no weather maps, no forecasts, no distant warnings carried on screens or signals. The sky offered no explanation, only clouds and muted light. What no one could see was that the world itself had shifted. High above the earth, far beyond sight, something had changed the balance of sunlight and air. A veil, thin but powerful, had begun to wrap around the planet, the quiet aftermath of an event half a world away. But in 1816, all people knew was this: summer had arrived on the calendar. And yet, it had not arrived at all. And as days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, it became clear that this was not a passing chill. It was something else, something slow, something unfamiliar, and something that would touch nearly everyone, whether they understood it or not. A world built on the seasons. In the early 1800s, the rhythm of life moved at a slower pace. There were no satellites watching the sky, no forecasts scrolling across screens, no warnings issued days in advance. Instead, people watched the land. They read the seasons through the soil beneath their feet, the angle of the sun, the timing of birdsong, and the feel of the wind against their skin. Knowledge of weather was local, personal, and earned over a lifetime. For most families, survival depended on the steady reliability of those patterns. Spring meant planting. Summer meant growth. Autumn meant harvest. And winter, harsh as it could be, was expected, planned for, and endured. Food did not come from distant places. It came from nearby fields, from gardens behind homes, from grain stored carefully through the colder months. A single failed harvest could strain a household. Two could ruin it. This was a world still shaped by muscle and animal labor. Fields were plowed by hand or with horses. Crops rose and fell at the mercy of rain and temperature. When the weather changed, there was little anyone could do but wait. In Europe, the scars of earlier famines still lingered in memory. In North America, communities were expanding westward, relying heavily on small farms and local trade. Stability depended not on abundance, but on predictability. That predictability was beginning to falter. When the cold lingered longer than expected, people adjusted in small ways. They delayed planting. They chose hardier seeds. They trusted that nature would correct itself. It always had before. But as days passed and the air refused to warm, unease settled quietly into daily life. Not fear, not yet, but a subtle discomfort. The sense that something familiar had shifted, just slightly out of place. No one spoke of global causes. The idea that weather in one region could be shaped by events across the ocean was still unfamiliar. Storms were local. Cold was local. The sky above you was the sky that mattered, and so people looked upward, searching for signs. Clouds moved slowly overhead. Rain fell when it should not have. Sunlight filtered through haze, never quite strong enough to dry the fields. Still, most believed summer would come. It was simply late. And so the world waited, grounded in routines built for a climate that had, until now, always returned to normal. The distant cause, no one could see. Far from the fields of Europe and the farms of North America, far beyond the horizon of anyone feeling the cold of 1816, a mountain stood quietly in the tropics. Its name was Mount Tambora. Tambora rose on the island of Sumbawa in what is now Indonesia. To those who lived nearby, it was simply part of the landscape, a presence, green, broad, and largely still. In April of 1815, that calm ended. The eruption that followed was immense, larger than any eruption recorded in human history. But for most of the world, it happened unseen and unheard. Ash, gas, and fine particles were blasted high into the atmosphere, far above weather and clouds, into a layer of air where winds move slowly and linger. This material did not fall back to Earth quickly. Instead, it spread. Sulfur dioxide mixed with moisture in the upper air, forming a thin veil of reflective haze. It drifted silently around the globe, carried by currents no one yet understood. There was no shockwave felt in Europe, no tremor in American soil, no immediate sign that anything had changed. Tambora's eruption did not announce itself to the wider world. Months passed, seasons turned, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, sunlight weakened. Not enough to darken the days completely, not enough to alarm anyone at first, just enough to cool the air, to soften the sun's warmth, to tip the balance of seasons ever so slightly. The planet had not stopped receiving light, but it was receiving less. And in a world finely tuned to the rhythm of temperature and time, even a small change mattered. By the time snow fell in June, the cause was already overhead, circling the Earth, invisible, persistent, and patient. The people living through it would not learn Tambora's name for decades. All they knew was that the sky no longer felt familiar, and whatever had changed, it had changed quietly, without warning, without explanation, and without regard for borders or distance. The sun grows dim. By the time the summer of 1816 settled in, something about the light itself felt different. The sun still rose each morning, following its familiar path across the sky, but it no longer carried the same warmth. Its brightness seemed muted, as though filtered through a thin curtain. Days often began beneath a pale haze. Clouds lingered without urgency, stretching long into the afternoon. When the sun did break through, it felt distant, present, but restrained. People noticed the change in small, quiet ways. Morning frost clung to fields longer than it should have. Dew failed to evaporate. Soil stayed cold beneath bare hands. Even on clear days, the air refused to warm. In the evenings, the sky took on unusual colors. Sunsets glowed red and orange, deeper than memory suggested. The light scattered across the horizon in ways both beautiful and unsettling. No one yet understood why. The haze overhead was nearly invisible, but it reflected just enough sunlight back into space to matter. A fraction of warmth lost each day, accumulating slowly. This was not darkness. It was dimness, a gentle subtraction from the familiar balance between sun and earth. Across continents, the same strange light was observed. Painters remarked on the vivid sunsets. Farmers remarked on the cold ground. Travelers remarked on gray skies that seemed unwilling to lift. Still, many hoped the change was temporary. Weather, after all, had always been unpredictable. A cool season could still turn warm. A delayed summer could still arrive late and generous. But as weeks passed, the pattern held. The sun rose. It shone faintly. And the world remained cool. What no one could yet see was how delicately life depended on that missing warmth. Crops waited for heat that did not come. Animals struggled to find enough growth in the fields. People adapted day by day, unaware that the dimming sun marked the beginning of a season unlike any they had known before. The change was subtle, and that made it all the more powerful. Summer fails to arrive. By June, patience began to wear thin. The calendar insisted it was summer, but the land disagreed. In New England, frost returned again and again. Gardens that had been planted with care were blackened overnight. Farmers replanted, hopeful at first, then more cautiously. Some seeds never sprouted at all. In parts of Europe, cold rain fell steadily, soaking fields already struggling to warm. Rivers swelled. Low ground turned muddy and unworkable. Crops leaned under the weight of moisture and cold. Snow fell where it did not belong. Light snow, drifting briefly through summer air before melting away. Strange, quiet, and deeply unsettling. Children watched it fall with curiosity. Adults watched with concern. Each cold morning brought the same question. Would today be different? Often it was not. People adapted in small ways. Extra layers stayed close at hand. Fires burned longer. Meals were stretched, portions quietly reduced without discussion. At first, there was still hope. Surely July would be warmer. Surely August would bring heat. But July came, and the air remained cool. Fields that should have been tall and green lagged behind. Corn struggled. Wheat ripened unevenly. Hay crops were thin, leaving little for livestock later in the year. Farmers walked their land, hands clasped behind their backs, measuring growth against memory. Something was wrong, and yet there was still no single moment of realization. No announcement, no warning. Just the slow understanding that this was not a late summer. It was a summer that had failed entirely. As the season continued, concern spread quietly from farm to farm, from village to village. People spoke in lowered voices. Plans were revised. Expectations softened. The earth, it seemed, was waiting for warmth that never arrived. And so were the people who depended on it. Everyday life during an unnatural season. As the weeks passed, life continued, not as it should have, but as it had to. People rose each morning and followed familiar routines, even as the world around them felt subtly out of step. Animals were fed. Fires were tended. Fields were walked, measured, and quietly worried over. In kitchens, meals changed. Bread was sliced thinner. Stews stretched further with water and roots. Nothing was wasted. Even scraps were saved, dried, or repurposed, just in case the months ahead demanded more restraint. Markets reflected the strain before words ever did. Grain prices crept upward. Not sharply at first, just enough to be noticed. A coin that once bought plenty, now bought a little less. Families adjusted without ceremony. Children wore heavier clothing than usual for the season. Windows stayed closed against damp air. Laundry took longer to dry if it dried at all. Livestock felt the change as well. Pastures produced less grass. Hay stores grew worryingly thin. Animals that should have fattened through summer instead held their weight or slowly lost it. Still, there was no panic. People trusted endurance. They trusted that hardship, like weather, moved in cycles. In the evenings, neighbors gathered closer to warmth. Conversations drifted toward the season, how strange it felt, how long it had lasted, how next year would surely be better. Some began to leave, not all at once, and not dramatically. A family might move west in search of better land. Another might travel south to stay with relatives. These were quiet decisions, made carefully, often without farewell. Most stayed. They waited. They watched the sky, hoping for change. And they carried on, adapting their lives to a summer that offered no generosity, only endurance. It was in these ordinary days, marked by small sacrifices and steady patience, that the true weight of the year, without a summer, was felt. Not in moments of disaster, but in the long, quiet effort to live as normally as possible in a season that refused to be normal. The cold summer in Europe. Across Europe, the summer of 1816 revealed itself not through sudden disaster, but through atmosphere. Days passed beneath a ceiling of cloud that seemed permanently fixed in place. Rain fell lightly, then steadily, then endlessly, not as storms, but as a constant presence. The land remained damp, cool, and unresponsive. In cities and towns, the change was felt as much indoors as out. Streets stayed quiet, travel slowed. Goods that normally moved easily between regions were delayed or spoiled. Markets opened as usual, but selection thinned. Familiar foods became harder to find, not because they were gone, but because they could no longer arrive on time. The countryside struggled in different ways. Fields saturated with rain resisted planting and harvest alike. Grain that survived grew unevenly. Farmers could not rely on their usual knowledge. The weather no longer followed recognizable patterns. Church bells rang on schedule. Workdays began and ended as expected. But beneath these routines lay a growing awareness that the season itself was unreliable. People spoke less about warmth and more about waiting. Waiting for the rain to stop. Waiting for the ground to firm. Waiting for sunlight strong enough to matter. There was little drama in this waiting. Instead, there was fatigue. A weariness that settled into bones and conversations. A sense that effort no longer produced predictable results. By the time summer gave way to autumn, much of Europe understood that the year had not merely been cold. It had been disorienting. A season that offered no clear rhythm, no dependable cues, only persistence. And that uncertainty would linger far longer than the rain itself. A Stormy Summer by Lake Geneva. While much of Europe endured the cold and rain in fields and streets, a small group of travelers found themselves gathered beside Lake Geneva in Switzerland. They had come expecting a pleasant summer. Instead, they found themselves confined indoors. Rain fell day after day, drumming softly against windows and rooftops. The lake lay dark and restless beneath low clouds. Walks were postponed. Outings canceled. Even simple excursions became uncomfortable beneath the persistent damp and chill. Inside the villa where they stayed, time slowed. Candles burned longer into the afternoon. Fires were kept lit despite the season. Books were read and reread. Conversations wandered, lingering where they might otherwise have moved on. Among the group were Mary Shelley, her husband Percy Shelley, and the poet Lord Byron. Cut off from the summer they expected, they passed the hours talking, reading aloud, and sharing ideas. Outside, storms rolled across the lake, their distant thunder echoing through the mountains. One evening, as the rain continued, a challenge was proposed. Each person would write a story, not with urgency, not with expectation of greatness, simply as a way to pass the time during a season that refused to cooperate. For Mary Shelley, the atmosphere mattered, the dim light, the restless weather. The sense of isolation created not by distance, but by climate. Ideas took shape slowly, drawn from conversation, imagination, and the uneasy feeling that nature itself had become unpredictable. What emerged would later become one of the most enduring works of literature in the modern world. But in that moment, it was just a story forming quietly, shaped by rain, cold air, and long evenings spent indoors. The year without a summer did not only disrupt crops and trade, it altered moods, it reshaped conversations, and, in at least one quiet villa by a lake, it gave space for imagination to unfold in the absence of warmth and light. The Birth of Frankenstein. The story that began to form during those long evenings by Lake Geneva did not arrive all at once. It came slowly, as ideas often do. Mary Shelley listened as conversations drifted from science to philosophy, from recent discoveries to older questions about life and responsibility. Outside, the rain continued its steady rhythm, reinforcing the sense that the world beyond the villa had narrowed. Sleep did not always come easily. In the dim light of candle and fire, imagination lingered longer than usual. Thoughts wandered. Images surfaced and faded, shaped by the uneasy feeling that something familiar had shifted in the natural order. One night, an idea took hold, not as a finished story, but as a scene, quiet, unsettling, and persistent. A vision that returned again and again until it demanded attention. Mary Shelley began to write. She did not set out to create a work of horror. Instead, she explored questions already present in the world around her. what happens when human ambition outpaces understanding, what responsibility follows creation. The cold, the storms, and the isolation of that summer provided the backdrop. Nature, once dependable, had become unpredictable. The boundary between control and consequence felt thinner than before. As the weeks passed, the story grew. What would eventually be known as Frankenstein took shape not in a moment of terror, but in a season of confinement and reflection. Its origins were quiet, born from conversation, observation, and the strange stillness imposed by a summer that never arrived. The novel would later take on a life far beyond its beginnings, but at its core it carried traces of that year, a world slightly out of balance, a climate that refused to behave, and the human impulse to seek meaning in uncertainty. The year without a summer left its mark not only on fields and markets, but on imagination itself, shaping stories that continue to echo long after the weather returned to normal. Global connections slowly revealed. As the year unfolded, people in distant regions began to notice that their experiences were not isolated. Cold summers were being reported far beyond a single valley or nation. Letters described frost in places where it did not belong. Newspapers carried brief mentions of failed crops, unseasonable weather, and skies that appeared unusually hazy. At first, these observations remained unconnected. Weather was still understood as a local event. Storms belonged to the place they occurred. Cold was explained by chance, by fate, or by divine will. The idea that a single cause could shape seasons across continents was not yet part of common understanding. But patterns were forming. Artists remarked on vivid sunsets appearing across Europe. Travelers noted similar light in ports and countryside alike. Scholars quietly compared notes, sensing that something broader was at work, even if they lacked the tools to explain it fully. The science of climate was still young. Instruments were limited, records were uneven, and yet careful observers began to recognize that the atmosphere itself could carry change over great distances. Long after the cold summer had passed, attention turned backward. Accounts were gathered, reports were compared. Slowly, the connection between the eruption of Mount Tambora and the global cooling of 1816 began to emerge. The realization was subtle, not dramatic. No single moment marked the discovery. Instead, understanding accumulated quietly, much like the ash that had once spread unseen through the upper air. For the first time, it became clear that the world was more interconnected than anyone had assumed. An event in the tropics could alter harvests in Europe, and a distant mountain could dim sunlight across an ocean. The year without a summer became an early lesson in planetary balance, a reminder that the systems shaping daily life were vast, shared, and largely invisible. It was a realization that would take generations to fully absorb. But it began here, with careful observation, patient comparison, and the growing sense that the Earth itself was part of a single, connected system. Adaptation and movement. As it became clear that the strange season would not correct itself, people began to make quiet adjustments. There were no sweeping declarations, no mass departures announced all at once. Instead, decisions were made slowly, often within the privacy of families and close communities. Some chose to move. In North America, a number of families traveled westward, seeking land that promised better conditions or greater opportunity. Others moved south, hoping for milder weather. These journeys were rarely dramatic. They were practical responses to uncertainty. Most, however, stayed where they were. They adapted. Farming practices shifted. Hardier crops were favored, storage became more careful, and communities shared resources when they could, drawing on habits of cooperation already long established. Life did not stop. Children continued to learn trades. Marriages were celebrated quietly. Work carried on, shaped by necessity rather than optimism. The year without a summer did not bring immediate collapse. Instead, it asked for endurance. People learned to live with unpredictability, to make plans that allowed for failure, to expect less from the seasons, and to rely more heavily on one another. By the time temperatures slowly began to recover, many had already changed how they lived. Some of those changes remained. Migration patterns shifted, communities reorganized. Knowledge was passed forward, marked by memory rather than theory. The strange year became something people spoke of later, in quieter tones. not as a single moment of crisis, but as a period when life required patience, flexibility, and careful thought. And in adapting to that year, people unknowingly prepared themselves for a world that would continue to change. The climate returns, slowly. There was no clear moment when the year without a summer ended. No announcement, no sudden warmth, no single morning that felt like a return to normal. Instead, the change came gradually. Seasons passed, and little by little the air began to behave as it once had. Summers warmed modestly, winters followed familiar patterns. Crops responded again to expectations shaped by long experience. The haze in the sky thinned. Sunlight grew stronger, more reliable. The muted light that had lingered for so long slowly gave way to brighter days, though few could say exactly when the shift occurred. People noticed the difference not all at once, but in small confirmations. Fields recovered, harvests improved, the ground warmed beneath working hands, life eased back into older rhythms. Yet the memory remained. Those who had lived through 1816 carried the knowledge forward. They spoke of it when weather turned strange, when summers felt uncertain, when expectations failed. The year became a reference point, a reminder that the natural world, though often dependable, was never guaranteed. In time, children grew into adults who had only heard the stories. The experience faded from daily concern into shared memory, but the planet itself had not forgotten. Ash had long since settled. The atmosphere cleared, balance returned, and still the quiet lesson of that year endured, that even slow changes, nearly invisible at first, could reshape lives across continents. The climate returned, not dramatically, just steadily and without ceremony. Reflection on a connected world. Looking back, the year without a summer stands out not for any single moment, but for what it revealed. At the time, most people could not have imagined that a distant mountain, far beyond their experience or awareness, had shaped the rhythm of their days. The idea that weather could be shared across the globe was still unfamiliar, and yet, that year quietly demonstrated how connected the world truly was. A change in the atmosphere above the tropics cooled fields in Europe. A veil of ash dimmed sunlight over North America. The same strange season unfolded in places separated by oceans, languages, and borders. The connection was invisible, but it was real. In the years that followed, understanding grew slowly, observations were recorded, patterns were studied. Knowledge accumulated not through urgency, but through patience. The year without a summer became part of a larger story, one that showed how human life is shaped by forces both near and distant. It also revealed something quieter, that societies are often changed not by sudden collapse, but by subtle shifts that ask people to adapt. That endurance, cooperation, and memory matter as much as strength. Long after the cold had passed, the lesson remained. The Earth is not a collection of separate places. It is a shared system, and even small changes carried gently across time and distance can leave lasting marks on how people live, move, and imagine their place in the world. A closing bedtime thought. As the story of the year without a summer comes to rest, it leaves behind a quieter image, not of storms or cold fields, but of evenings returning to balance. The sun sets as expected. Light fades gently from the sky. The air cools, but not unnaturally so. Seasons resume their familiar rhythm, moving forward without urgency. For those who lived through 1816, the memory lingered softly. It became something spoken of in passing, recalled when weather felt strange or when the world seemed briefly out of alignment. And then, slowly, it became history. Yet even now, the lesson remains calm and steady, that the world is capable of change without warning, that those changes do not always arrive loudly, and that people, more often than not, adapt quietly, one day at a time. As night settles in, the earth continues its motion, turning, breathing, balancing forces far beyond human sight. The same sky that once dimmed now clears. The same sun that weakened returns in full. And somewhere, fields grow as expected again, guided by warmth, patience, and time. This is the nature of long stories. They do not end abruptly. They fade, and in that fading, they make space for rest.